Okay, so yeah, as Katie was saying, my name is Heloise and I am a clinical psychologist. I'm very conscious when doing this talk that I'm talking to a variety of people who either have PCD themselves or have young people who have PCD. And I was trying to sort of give a little bit of something for everybody. The other thing I'm very conscious of is that paediatric services increasingly have psychology as part of them. And there's much less provision generally, but specifically in psychology for PCD and in adults. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the role of psychology in PCD, and that obviously applies to paediatrics rather than adults. But as is the case in other conditions, hopefully it's sort of a path that will be trodden for adults too. So let's see. So in a slightly more humorous way, I suppose, but with a serious undertone, I often get asked what my job is, and a lot of the assumptions about what my job is a little bit different to what it actually is. So just to debunk a few myths, what it isn't is, so lots of people sort of say, do you do what Freud does? You know, is it all about sort of unconscious impulses and being in love with your mother and that kind of stuff, and lying on a sofa and delving into your deepest, darkest secrets? Absolutely not. That's not the kind of work that I do. That's not clinical psychology. The other thing is often people sort of seem to think that they really have to be hitting rock bottom or, you know, in some really cool place in order to access psychology. That's certainly not the case in PCD. Services across the country are sort of separated for different conditions and different aspects of mental health, but certainly in PCD, that's not how we're seeking to work. It's certainly something that we're trying to be a lot more proactive with. So when I approach somebody and they go, oh, no, I'm fine, I'm like, I have every confidence that you're fine, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's nothing that we can think about together or talk about, or I'd like to learn a little bit about you and find out a bit about yourself. So, so it's not necessarily about psychology only being applicable when we hit rock bottom. And the one I get probably most of all is, can you read my mind? Although in many ways that might make my job simpler if I'd somehow been bestowed with that ability in the training. No, I have absolutely no ability to read anybody's mind whatsoever. You know, we might sometimes pick up on body language or something like that, but not particularly in any way that you wouldn't of your, like, each other or yourselves anyway. So yeah, no mind reading abilities. So what it is, a slightly sort of dry explanation here, is the application of psychological theory to understand, prevent, and relieve psychological distress and promote well-being. So it's quite a general definition there, but gives you the idea that, you know, in different services, we might, depending on the resource that we have, we might be able to work in different ways, but ideally trying to prevent as much of the distress as we possibly can is usually sort of the best course of action. But even when somebody is struggling, you know, we're not always aware of when we're sort of heading in a certain direction. Even when somebody's struggling, there's absolutely, you know, things that we can do and ways we can work together. So there's no sort of right or wrong with that, but often earlier is better. And you're probably quite aware of lots being talked about in the news over the last few years, or increasing amounts in the news, about sort of a bit of a well-being agenda and well-being being talked about in schools quite a lot, and resilience and those kind of buzzwords. Kind of whatever position you take with that, it's increasingly something that we're aware of and talking about in terms of how we speak to young children. You know, it's no longer a kind of children should be seen and not heard type sort of frame of mind. You know, we're much more conscious about how we're talking to each other than we used to be. Just a few of the practicalities in terms of how myself and the other psychologists that I've connected with who work in PCD work. So it's classic, isn't it? I've got things that should pop up now. Here we go. So we work very flexibly. So essentially, you know, the term that often gets used is person-centered, but that really is what it is. We will meet with somebody, whether it's a parent or a young person, and seek to understand where they're at. What's important to them is what's usually important to us. And the amount of time we'll meet with them for, the scenario, whether it be in clinic or outside of clinic, we will seek to be as flexible as we need to be in order to be helpful to a patient, as is often the term used in a hospital, but whether that be a client or a service user or whatever term is used in whatever setting. And that's generally how clinical psychologists often seek to work. In PCD, this is something we're talking about because 2 of the 4 psychologists in post across the 4 centres have started since January. And so we've been talking a lot about how can we be most helpful? When do people want to see us? How do we work? And something we're talking about quite a bit is whether routinely being part of annual reviews is a helpful thing for us to do. But the conclusion we seem to be coming to at the moment is yes, that's probably a good way of capturing sort of how somebody is. So even if somebody's not sort of particularly wanting psychology to be a sort of a significant part of their care, having an opportunity yearly to touch base and find out how somebody is and help them understand a little bit about how we work as well. The whole, we don't read minds, we're not going to impose something on you, we just want to try and support you as best we can, is generally a helpful thing. So it's quite a 2-way process. And yeah, more if and when needed. So whether that's sort of extra individual sessions between clinic appointments, or whether somebody wants us to be routinely a part of their clinic appointments, or whether somebody's saying, I'm okay with annual review, but can we just leave it at that for the moment? I'll let you know if I want more. Yeah, we sort of work pretty flexibly, but can increase it or limit it as and when. In terms of what we do, we try and advocate for patients and parents. So often in clinic appointments, for example, the team will have sort of the multidisciplinary team, that is, will have specific things that they have to try and achieve and make sure that they do, and you guys will have sort of time limits. You want to be out of there within a certain amount of time, quite understandably. There are these kind of competing priorities, and often a role that we will take is sort of helping with that communication. If someone's sort of got it in their head, what I need to do is X, Y, Z, sometimes they might miss out on some of the sort of often non-verbal communication, going, I'm really stressed by this, my parking's running out, I need to go, you've not heard that my child's poorly, I need to get back to them, all those kinds of things. And then the other thing is providing consultation to the teams as well. So if there's something that we can helpfully do behind the scenes between clinic appointments or in meetings, or sometimes we'll have young people or parents saying to us, what my priority is this, and that's something that we can be feeding back to the team, but also feeding back sort of more psychological ways of thinking to the team in order to marry them together with the things that are important to the doctor or the nurse or the dietitian, the physio. Yeah. So I thought it might be helpful to just kind of anchor, I guess, my thinking in just a few of the scenarios that I feel come up slightly regularly, although they're obviously caricatures and they're not based on any individual people. But the things that I sometimes often hear said are things like, Laura isn't doing enough physio. I don't think Bobby understands the seriousness of PCD. Obviously, those are both parent perspectives usually. PCD gets in the way of me doing the things I actually want to do. Why does everyone keep talking to me about PCD, PCD, PCD? There's more to life. And whether I do lunchtime physio or not doesn't seem to make a difference. So why bother? And actually, in some way, all of those perspectives are really understandable. So I'll sort of try and touch on them a little bit as we kind of go forward. But what I wanted to do was draw a little bit on a fairly established psychological theory, a way in which we work, an intervention, in order to help us think a little bit about working with anybody of any age. So this isn't just applicable to young people. And this is the bit that I was saying, I was trying to sort of think about how everybody could get something out of this talk. If you're interested, this is based on a therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. So when we get these kinds of scenarios brought up, I think it's quite easy to feel, well, do I start, you know, a parent saying one thing, a young person saying another, the team's priority is a different one altogether. That can be quite overwhelming. So often it's quite good to take a step back and break it down. Okay, where do I start? What are the factors going on here? And often there are some version of all four of these. So acceptance and commitment therapy is primarily a behavioural therapy. So it focuses on the function of the behaviour that somebody is displaying. And by behaviour, I don't mean, you know, as behaviour often gets talked about, you know, bad behaviour or good behaviour. I just mean what we do. So we all are constantly engaging in behaviours. So it's almost more like actions than behaviours, but yeah. And different perspectives, that different therapies, different theories might focus on different elements of these four primarily. So acceptance and commitment therapy, the real sort of basis of it is thinking about what's important to you. And what's important to Rachel might be different to what's important to Jessica. Doesn't mean anybody's right or wrong. It's just purely about what makes you you. And that's sort of coming back to that idea of, you know, you don't come into a room with an agenda, not as a psychologist. You come in, well, the agenda you come in with is seeking to understand where somebody is at. So first of all, it's good to think about values. Now, if you fancy it, this is a bit of an overwhelming table, but that's not meant to be. I wrote down essentially a bunch of values that might sort of get you thinking a little bit, but it might be that it feels like something else is of great priority to you. And I've put a column for how important is that value to you. So when you think about it, think maybe 1 to 10. 10 is, it's the most important thing to me ever. And you can have several that are 10. You can have none that are 10. You know, it's just to get you thinking about it. So ignore the column all the way to the right, first of all. So the values that I listed were romantic relationships, friendships, family relationships. So there are sort of, you know, it's pulling apart things that might be slightly connected, especially with this next one, parenthood. But there are subtle differences within them as well. So family relationships might be sort of your extended relationships. It could include your relationships with your children, but parenthood is much more about kind of the kind of choices you make as a parent, the things you choose to prioritize as a parent, that kind of stuff. Leisure and fun, so the things you like to do with your spare time or any time that you happen to have occasionally. Your career or job, and within that might be money as well. Your health and physical wellness, so it might be about exercise, might be a bit more about nutrition, you know, whatever is springing to mind for you. Social engagement, which I guess would also include things like you know, environmentalism or anything like that. Spirituality, which may or may not be religion, depending on how you interpret it. And personal development and growth. Again, might be a bit connected with things like career, might also be separate. So maybe run through them all in your head, and with that first column in mind, how important is this to you? Think about like your gut feeling about what rating you would give it out of 10, 10 being it's the most important thing. Okay, I've not left too much time because I think gut feeling is the emphasis there. Don't think about it too much. So then look at the last column. How much is your behavior in line with that value? And again, give yourself sort of just 30 seconds or so to run down that list and give yourself a bit of an idea of 1 to 10, how much is my behavior in line with that value? 10 out of 10 is, I am living that. I could not live that anymore. And then the opposite being 1. Now it's a little bit tricky because we're not writing them down unless you've chosen to, but you might have an idea of whether your rating on the first column was particularly different to your rating on the next column. It might surprise you how close together they are and how much you are living in line with something that you thought maybe you wouldn't have been. Equally, it might be the opposite. or you might have actually rated something as quite important to you that you hadn't realized was important to you. It's just about the process of thinking about this, really, that I'm trying to emphasize. And this really is the cornerstone of this approach. So with this kind of idea of really thinking through the stuff that matters to you in mind, this is just obviously a really simple line with away on one end and towards on the other. And the question is, how, if you're situated at the center of it, let's say, how much does any one thing that you do bring you towards what you're valuing? Now, you might think away is kind of the opposite, that away is actually the bad thing. You're moving away from what you value, which on one level, I suppose there's some truth to that, but actually it's not necessarily. Away is much more about you are trying to sort of avoid an uncomfortable inner experience. So it might be, for example, that's not a very helpful way of saying it. It might be that in one situation you consciously move away from something that you value, but for a very good reason. So it might be that, I suppose lockdown probably brings up loads of these kinds of examples. It might be that actually your career is incredibly important to you, but also your role as a parent is incredibly important to you. And you might have been in really difficult situations where the two are sort of put against each other a little bit. And in order to move towards one, you are having to move away from another. And you're having to bury that feeling a little bit because it's uncomfortable to you. Does that make a little bit of sense? How complicated that kind of decision might be, and how it's not about good and bad. It's not about right and wrong. It's about having these things in mind and making conscious decisions. And having it on one line is really important because we can, in one moment, move away and then later move towards, once we have more resources or once the situation is different. You know, like personal resources is a big part of this. You know, you might be exhausted at some point, some element of your life has exhausted you, and to take steps towards what you value just feels too huge in that moment. So actually, you know, a mark of kindness to yourself, and this might be reflected in your values, that sort of desire to be kind to yourself, that desire to reflect on what you need, you know, might actually mean that you in a way move away from one value, but because of kindness to yourself being something that, self-compassion being something that you value, actually in that sense it's a move towards. So how complicated is that? But bearing this kind of matrix, these two sort of angles in mind, is what that's about. And that's why I was saying it's a behavioral approach, because actually it's about what we do, and what we do is not, you know, divorced from how we feel and what we think, but it's what we see, it's what others see, and it usually has quite a function. So it's usually a good place to start and a good way of measuring something for ourselves. I mean, for our own benefit ourselves. So you might say, well, that's all well and good. How do I manage what's going on in my mind? And just a snippet, you know, these are maybe slightly flippant examples, but I think we can probably all relate to some version of these. I should lose some weight, / read more, / get that degree, / make up with my parent, / so many other versions of that thought. The emphasis there being should. I think that's just massively human, to be slightly slave to all those should thoughts that are constantly going through our minds. Why am I not happy? Everyone on Instagram is. Even though we know they're not, we still fall into that way of thinking, but they look at it and they must be a bit happy because, you know, the sun's always shining there and their house always looks amazing. Their children always look happy. At least PCD is something that can be managed. I should be grateful. Every time I cough, people look at me like I have COVID. And I am insert negative thought because I have PCD. So I made the ones on the right more PCD focused, but I mean, they can be related to other things clearly. So I am less worthwhile because I'm overweight, for example. I'm less of a person, or I am anything really. I think that's something that we all have a version of those thoughts. So managing our mind, what on earth do we do? So this isn't interesting idea. You probably, I don't know if you can particularly read that, but there are these two unicorns. If you had a thought you were a unicorn, would you believe it? What do you guys reckon? If you had a thought, I am a unicorn, is that something you believe? You go, oh, my mind's told me I'm a unicorn, and therefore I am a unicorn. It's obviously a silly example, but hopefully makes quite a serious point, because the next unicorn says, so why do you believe it when you have a thought that you are ugly or stupid or crazy or unlovable? But you're not on your own. We all do it. We absolutely do. And that's the crux of this. This is a metaphor called the tug of war, which is often used in acceptance and commitment therapy. And it's a person tugging on this rope. And you can see on the other end, there's a monster, and it's got things written on it. This isn't PCD specific. It's got much more to do, this particular animation of it, with mental health more generally. So the things written on it are things like self-doubt and unworthiness and anxiety and sadness. And this person is tugging and tugging and tugging on this rope, desperately trying to win this fight with this monster that's making him feel unlovable and crazy and worthless, and all those thoughts that all of us, or some of us, get some version of. And what's the cost there, I guess? Is that person living life? Are they engaged with their friends? Are they thinking about that career they value so highly, or whatever else might be important to that person tugging on that rope? No, not really. All that stuff might be going on behind them, but actually internally, emotionally, they are engaged in that tug of war with that monster. So what's the alternative? That's the point, isn't it? What else could this person do? Well, they could drop the rope. It probably seems quite kind of silly to say that, the monster's still there, and that's kind of the point. You can't stop the monster being there any more than you can get rid of any other thought, however ridiculous or emotive. So we find it easier to push away this thought of I'm a unicorn, because I clearly am not. I have no horn. I am not a horse shape. That is a silly thought. So why is it not a silly thought for me to think I am completely unlovable? It is still a collection of sounds in my head. The difference really is that it's emotive, and internally I respond to it. It scares me. I start to think through the situations that prove it right in some way. And so I buy into it. I get hooked by it. That's the difference. So really the alternative that we're talking about, this dropping the rope, is acceptance. This is often a word that I think gets some reaction, because by acceptance, I don't mean rolling over. I don't mean going, fine. I will live this life. I will have these thoughts. I will suffer. It's not about that at all. What it is about is recognizing each of our humanness. So recognizing that those should thoughts are there, for example. Recognizing that there's always things that we're all kind of working on, and therefore, there's a certain amount of challenging emotion that comes up from them. So somebody who's, you know, working on losing weight, usually there's some difficult feelings there about their weight. Yeah, human experience is not an easy thing. So acceptance is kind of, it's sort of recognizing that you are the sky in this metaphor. We are the sky, and clouds pass by. They might be white fluffy clouds, i.e. inconsequential, just thoughts passing on by. They might be horrible, dark, stormy, feel like they're going to be there forever, like we've been having this May kind of clouds. But they're all just clouds. The sky is still there behind the clouds. Yeah. But we can't see it. We might lose it from sight for quite a period of time. We might start to lose faith that it's there. You know, all these difficult emotional experiences might come up. But ultimately, the sky's there and the clouds are there. It's rare that we get a cloud-free day. They happen sometimes. And it's accepting that there is that variability, but showing some sort of conviction in the idea that clouds come and go, but that sometimes our belief is what changes things. So, you know, I believe when it rains that it rains forever, you know, because it feels like that, feels tough. Especially when it rains for a few days, it's like, this is never going to go away. This is awful. Yeah. So I've said the word acceptance, and acceptance is a really big deal in acceptance and commitment therapy, as you can probably imagine. But this idea is really more about an element of therapy, which is called diffusion. And what that talks about really is sort of almost, you know, you can do exercises where you really reflect on what's going on for you in that moment. So it's very much about living in the moment. And you sort of, you know, you might have thoughts that come up, good, bad, you know, whatever judgment you're choosing to bestow on them, that it doesn't matter. They're just thoughts, aren't they? And you put them on a cloud and watch them drift away. To re-emphasize that idea that actually they are thoughts, they are this collection of noises in our minds, and that we sometimes get hooked by them, we can unhook ourselves, they might come back, and that the frustration we start to feel, you know, those moments where we start to pick that rope back up and get into that tug of war, that actually adds to our suffering. Does that make some sense? And those examples that, you know, those sort of scenarios that I brought up initially about the challenges people have with PCD, this massively applies to PCD. You know, those sort of like, my child isn't doing enough physio. Actually, that is a belief. You know, maybe there's a really important role in trying to understand everybody's perspective and sort of going from that. So it might be that actually that's not the evidence. You know, that person who said, I do lunchtime physio and it makes no difference. Actually, they might be right. Is it worth having a bit of an experiment about that? Yeah. Staying present is another really, really key bit of acceptance and commitment therapy. So the idea is our minds, as you know, we've been talking about so far, sort of draw us into the future, draw us into the past. You know, they are very active things that we think we have control of, or we talk about like we have control of, but we really, you know, that's limited, that sense of control we actually have over our minds. We get random thoughts most of the time. Often if we think about the past quite a lot, we get quite bogged down by sort of guilt and regret and sort of thoughts about things people did to us that weren't great, or things we did to others that weren't great. And if we draw ourselves into the future quite a bit, we start to get worried about the stuff we've got coming up, or the stuff we don't have coming up, or, you know, worried about whether the June relaxation rules will happen, you know, all those kinds of things. Whereas actually all we have for certainty is the present. It's perfectly normal for our minds to travel into the future. It's perfectly normal to feel worry about stuff that it encounters there. It's also perfectly normal for our minds to get drawn into the past and for us to, you know, mull over some of those things that might have happened. The idea really is about the flexibility and noticing we're doing it so that we don't just live in those places. We also have the flexibility to come back to the now. Yeah. So that now that says, actually, you know, just because 2 years ago it was the case that you needed to do lunchtime physio, maybe that needs re-exploring. How about we just, you know, approach that with open curiosity as a team, rather than getting annoyed with each other, which usually means we're picking up that rope again. We're getting back into that struggle of you will do what you're told. So back more concretely to PCD. So those cases that I was talking about, what we don't do is persuade people to do something that they don't want to do. That's not really going to be helpful. If you think about positioning, I guess, in quite a sort of concrete way, you know, either you've got a child or when you were a child, usually when someone's sort of trying to get you to do something, you end up in this very oppositional kind of, you will do what you're told, no, I won't. And it almost becomes more about pushing back than about what the actual topic is. It's about gaining the power. It's about feeling like you're in control of your life. Really, we tend to get a lot further if instead of positioning ourselves like this, we try and position ourselves alongside each other. We come next to each other and try and see the world through somebody else's eyes. We try and understand what they're seeing, what they're thinking. And usually by doing that, they will show some reciprocation with it. They'll also be open to understanding what we're thinking too. So this is just a bit of a cartoon to give you an idea of that. You know, these two people, one sees a 6, one sees a 9. Clearly they're both right. If they just keep telling each other, no, it's a 6, no, it's a 9, you know, usually nothing great happens. If they get alongside each other and maybe walk around it together, they might realize, oh yeah, we're kind of both right. Who knows which way is up, who knows which way is down in this interesting, strange life that we live. Let's just try and understand it. And this sort of question mark is about sort of, you know, I said we don't persuade people. We try and help people think through their priorities. And by priorities, I don't stop at PCD. You know, what's important to them in all aspects of their life, socially, as well as educationally, and, you know, what are their life goals and what's important to them now. And that might be different in 6 months' time or 2 years' time or whatever. And showing flexibility to that is also key, you know. So making sure we don't greet someone who's 12, who's had PCD since they were 6, and go, how's that Barbie collection going? They can change as they get older. And the same applies to us as adults. You know, if you did that same values exercise with the ratings in 2 years' time, you should be entitled to give entirely different ratings to what's important to you then. You should feel that flexibility. So making the space to work alongside each other, to think through things together, and support somebody to come to a conclusion that they're happy with. Sometimes that does mean tolerating people making decisions that somebody else thinks may be unwise. Obviously, safeguards have to be put in place, and I work in paediatrics, and that is something that I have to bear in mind. So making sure that they, depending on age as well, certainly with adolescents, making sure that there are safety nets so that if they struggle, you know, if we're sort of trying to create a certain amount of independence, there's only so much they could suffer as a result. But actually, isn't the point of growing up to sort of become a functioning, independent person? And we have to apply that to healthcare as well. We just have to be cautious about how we go about it and how we support somebody to achieve that. And sometimes showing somebody the worries that we have as well, saying, I totally hear you and I can see why you want that. Do you know what's in my mind? Do you know what worry I've got about that? You know, what do you think about my worry? You know, having those open conversations sometimes is kind of the most helpful way we can move forward. And when it comes to adults and adult healthcare, there's a very different approach, and we're all assumed to have capacity to make our own decisions, even if they are unwise. So to come back to this idea, remember the arrow with towards and away. This is essentially the same idea, but just a slightly different graphic to give that more of a sense of sort of going forward. You know, we constantly reach kind of forks in the road, and we can go towards our values, we can go away from our values. The other thing to bear in mind is there's the short term and there's the longer term. You know, so we might in the short term make a decision to, in some area of our life, move away from a value. And the really important thing is that we do have the flexibility to do that, and that we've got eyes on it as well. So we know we're making a conscious decision to sort of to do that, to press pause on that one thing, or to actually move away from it temporarily. If it's no longer as important to us, that might actually be a slightly different scenario where we're not sort of moving away. But more often than not, it is actually just a sort of temporary move away, and then later we'll have to rethink it. And I've written hooked and unhooked, and that's got a lot to do with the internal experience. So by that, I mean emotions and I mean thoughts. You know, so we might, if we get hooked on a thought of, I shouldn't feel something, often that's going to lead us in a more away kind of direction. Yeah, usually that's how it's going to go. We all get hooked. Every day I get hooked by thoughts. It's what happens when I notice it. Yeah. So my behaviors might sort of show me that I'm hooked on a thought. Eventually, when I notice that, I have a choice. I can come back to this crossroads and figure out, okay, actually, I want to try and unhook myself a bit. How am I going to do that? Yeah, and challenging it. I think often, I've written sort of a couple of pointers there, often a helpful thing to do at this point is ask yourself big questions like, you know, what do I want my life to stand for? What, there's quite a, I think, an exercise that people can find quite shocking, which is stuff like writing your own, you know, gravestone or an epitaph or that kind of thing, to really push yourself to think, what do I want my life to have stood for? Again, though, that's something that should be able to be flexible. So if you were to write another one in 5 years' time, you know, you have the power to make that different. But it's noticing all the choices that you have, including the choices to do things like, you know, things that your healthcare professionals might say are unwise, or sitting in front of the TV for 3 days on end eating junk food because you just feel like you need it at that point. This isn't about leading a saintly life. It's about leading a conscious, focused on the present kind of life. Yeah. So that's kind of bringing me to the end. Hopefully that's sort of given you a little bit of something as well as linking it into PCD. But as I said, I found it a little bit tricky to know exactly how to pitch it. So if you want to ask things related to this, please do. If you want to ask things completely unrelated to this, but sort of psychology relevant, then go for that. Yeah, whatever feels helpful to you.
Well, thank you so much, Heloise. I think that was absolutely fantastic. I was captivated throughout the whole talk. I hope we have some questions from all of our patients. We can put them in the chat, or if you have, you can see there's like a little reactions button. You can click on that and do a little wave, and then feel free to unmute, and we can have a bit of a discussion with Heloise. One of the ones I was thinking about is the difference between children and adults, and how you facilitate the same kind of change, or conversations, really, not change, with the different age groups, and what are the differences between how do you approach those?
It's a really big question, really, isn't it? Because also when we talk about children, there's such a wide variety. So how I work with a 17-year-old is often very akin to how I might work with somebody who's 25 or 37 or 82. Because the way in which you can talk and the things that might be a priority to them are often, there are some similarities, but because you work in a person-centered way, there's always the flexibility built in. The things that are different when people are very little ones are often brought actually by their parents, or even, you know, 8-year-olds marched in, gone, you need to tell them to do this. That's often sort of how that goes. So actually, I think when they're very little, I see my role with the young people themselves often as engaging them and starting what is hopefully a positive lifelong kind of relationship with thinking psychologically, whether a psychologist is there or not, because thoughts, feelings, how they affect our behaviors, that stuff that just affects us all as humans, whatever job we do, wherever we do it, wherever we live, etc. And the most positive thing I think I can bestow is showing interest, curiosity in what that stuff is and validating it, whether it be good or bad feelings or whatever, and just showing that interest. And there's such an agenda in our society, I think, to be happy. I don't know if anyone feels the same or has noticed that particularly. It's like, oh, just be happy, or there, don't be sad, don't cry. There's always this kind of like, let's just shift gear and focus on being happy. But actually, life is made up of light and dark, and the light wouldn't be so light if it wasn't for the dark. And we have to feel this variety of emotions and experience lots of different thoughts and things in order to appreciate that. So however, the language is what changes when I'm working with someone who's very little through to somebody who's much older, as well as that individual person's priorities of what they want to talk about. But really the underlying ideas of what kind of is important for me to bestow is often quite similar.
Yeah, that makes sense. I see James has his hands up. If you would like to unmute yourself, James, feel free to ask your questions.
Hi, thank you. And hi, Heloise.
Hi.
Question regarding a soon-to-be 13-year-old choosing not really to do medication correctly, has unfortunately, because of this, now has an infection and is back on antibiotics. What's the best way for mum and I to deal with, I guess, the lack of, maybe not enthusiasm, but the lack of effort with the medication?
Yeah, great question. I think I think something that's often quite different for us as adults, and that's underpinned by how our brains develop, is that we hold a much longer term perspective in mind. So our brains are fully developed by the time we're sort of 25-ish or so. And the bit that carries on developing up to that age, so in the latter adolescence and stuff, is the part that plans and prioritizes and thinks through things in the long run. And that's why you often see much younger people just think about the next sort of 5 minutes, 10 minutes. If you see them go for a run on sort of fun runs and things, the little ones are often the ones who sprint and then stop, sprint and then stop. And the adults are the ones who start off kind of slower than they could do, but they know they've got to keep running for an hour. So let's sort of hold something back. And that, I think, is a difference that affects lots of different parts of life. And PCD management is another one of them. So essentially, we have to try and talk in a different language. So rather than it being about the same priorities as us, you need to do this in order to be well, in order to be able to do this when you're older, and in order to avoid this outcome, that kind of thing. To a young person, it's much more short term than that usually. It's thinking much more about, what is their priority right now? Is there anything that they're being kept away from as a result of this? Is there anything that they could gain in order to, is it anything they could gain by doing this better? Conversely, thinking through, is there anything they're gaining by not taking medication? For some, I wouldn't say this is usual, but for some young people, it might keep them off school, and they actually quite enjoy being in hospital. They enjoy the attention of hospital, or, that kind of thing. And thinking through that can be quite important. But that's why you'll often then find parents sort of uncomfortably and sort of jokingly going like, oh, I've had to bribe them to do this. And actually, I can really understand that. I can really understand when parents are essentially trying to talk their child's language, be like, look, I get this is my priority. Can you do this? And we will work towards this out, your outcome. You will earn, if you do this for a week, you will earn this. That's how I see that, often trying to talk a young person's language. When people do that, I think I'm often encouraging them to also explain, we're doing this because we get that at your age, you need extra things to motivate you. But actually, what we really hope is that you're getting that you feel better when you do this, that you get to be at school and see your friends. And so gently drawing those sort of links for them and encouraging them to see it as, when I do take my medication, I am able to do this. I am able to see this friend. I am able to engage fully in life. That's the idea, isn't it? It's figuring out what their values are and linking it with good care and health and stuff like that. That's a very waffly answer. I'm sorry, James.
That's all right. I just think as parents, I think it can be very frustrating because, you know, we know when she's not very well, and you can tell that. But it's almost as though she knows as well.
Yeah.
But she's choosing not to do anything about it.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest thing for us, is because we don't obviously want her to become so unwell that she has to go back into hospital. And you know, it's just difficult.
And I think when I totally empathize with your position there and the emotions this brings up in you, because you can just see how doing these few actions would then keep her out of hospital, would keep her well. You know, you can see the difference. Usually it's clearer to us who are, you know, slightly removed, the difference in our children when they're well and unwell, you know, in their sleep, in their general mood, in their appetite, and everything, as well as, you know, the coughing as well. So it's really painful to see, but I would encourage you to reflect on your own position as well, because I think when we feel, you know, such intense frustration and anxiety about where it might lead, you know, whether it will bring her to hospital or not, all those kinds of things, that's when we start to pick up our own rope. Yeah. And you'll be in that position with her. You know, you'll be so frustrated, you'll be saying to her, you know, come on, just do it. It's simple, just do it. And actually, like we said, that's likely to get a more sort of contrary response from her. So trying to see it through her eyes, trying to get, you know, what are the barriers? What do you find difficult about it? And just genuinely trying to understand, you know, using that kind of language that you're reassuring her. I'm not seeking to intervene here or anything. I just want to understand what goes on for you when you know, whichever time of day it is or whatever, you know, when you get up, or if it's all of it running through the whole day, when you get up and you've got to do your meds, you know, what's going through your mind at that point? What do you think about? And it might be that she goes, I'm thinking about, you know, what's happened to Poppy at school and whether she's going out with Darren. Whatever it is, it might not be about, but that gives you a clue, doesn't it? It says PCD is low down priority wise at that time of day. She's far more socially engaged at that point. So really just showing curiosity, not seeking a specific answer, just trying to understand what's going on for her.
Yeah, thank you.
And changing one thing at a time. Usually if it's all gone to pot, focus on one thing at a time. What feels most possible for her?
Yeah, to be fair, it's not normally like it, but we've just noticed over the last month it's it could be better.
Yeah, sorry to hear that.
That's all right.
I think we have another question from Adel, if you'd like to unmute and talk.
Thanks, Katie. Hi there. It's interesting just listening to the previous question. I guess one of the things from my own experience, and also from listening to parents at various PCD workshops and whatever that we've done, is just around the whole transition period from, you know, child into teenager into young adult can be quite a challenging time. And I've always felt it's an area that seems to not have been very well developed support-wise necessarily for individuals. And I guess in my mind, I've always thought it would be great to have some kind of a, you know, pre-COVID, some kind of a workshop for that sort of age group. You know, post-COVID, you know, some sort of online workshop maybe. And I just wondered, you know, in my head, I come sort of from a learning and development background, and I've always felt, you know, I'd love to get stuck into something like that, but I would need that clinical psychology input as well. And I just wondered, you know, has there ever been any thought given to that type of project or intervention, or maybe there's something already out there that, you know, we're just not aware of? It'd be good to get your insights on that.
So do you have I got this right in terms of sort of linking age and that kind of all the transitions people go through in terms of first step up to secondary and all those kinds of physical and emotional and social kind of developments and transitions, and then the link between those and health? Is that... Oh, you're on mute.
You're on mute still, Adel.
Yes, I think in general, I always sort of think of that sort of teen transition stage. And I almost think that, from being a child and a teenager, there's some point in that stage where there's almost like an aha moment where, yes, your parents have been very involved in the whole management of it before, but there becomes a realization of, oh my gosh, this is actually a condition I have, and this is what it means. And, and this is what, and I just don't feel that necessarily there's the right support in there across, whether it's PCD or whether it's another kind of illness or a condition, and I just think it's an area that I think we would benefit actually to sort of have more of an intervention for that sort of teenager, young adult stage, and dealing with something like this. Yeah. No, approaches or specific things that are done for that age group with them in mind.
I think you're very right, and you said that age group, but in my mind, with what you're saying, it sort of pretty much spans adolescence. Is that? So, in terms of health and transitions in health, something that was sort of developed at Southampton, but I think now is nationwide, is the Ready Steady Go approach to transition. But that is just focused on healthcare, and that's very focused on enabling young people to start to gather independence and independence from parents, but also independence from healthcare professionals to a certain extent, so that they're internalizing their own sort of facts and personal knowledge and all that kind of stuff. But that's very related to PCD, and I think there's much more of a kind of role for linking that with all the other stuff going on in life, because if you kind of separate things out too much, I think that often actually leads to more detrimental kind of self-care, because healthcare, that's stuff that happens in the hospital, and I do that at home in the evening kind of thing. That's not something that I think about elsewhere, and I think we can benefit from tying things in for young people. Most hospitals, certainly ours here in Southampton, has quite an active kind of youth support approach, and we do quite a lot of just support kind of groups, usually focused on things like cinema outings or pizza nights, or trying to get young people to do things together who don't necessarily all have PCD though at all. It's some are focused on conditions. PCD doesn't have a sort of condition specific approach, so seeing people who have lots of different long-term conditions that require them to incorporate different elements into their lives than maybe the other young people at school who maybe don't have those conditions do. And I think that can be quite beneficial, but still has quite a long way to go. It's quite opt-in, and so lots of people actually don't opt in, and you end up getting some of the same people doing the groups over and over again, or that kind of thing. So you get some very engaged people and some very not. So I think as you've probably got the idea, psychology and PCD is something that's still quite in its infancy, and we're all finding our feet in our different services, but we're linking up as much as possible in order to try and think, how can we work as consistently as possible to make sure people in different areas of the country get as similar a service as possible, but also as helpfully as possible, because there's a certain amount of resource in each centre. Can we sort of lend that to each other? Can we do virtual groups, or things where we help people link up and help people feel less different, a bit more sort of engaged with PCD being a normal part of life for lots of young people, all that kind of stuff. So it's something that I think we're thinking of more than has happened, but obviously there's a certain amount that the multidisciplinary teams have been trying to do without psychologists there. It's not obviously all psychologist centric, but I think we have a lot to add to that kind of approach, and that certainly is our hope, and increasing our presence more generally as well. So in our little group of psychologists that we've now started meeting, we agreed that this talk would be sort of the first of hopefully more ongoing talks and increasing the amount that we're sort of reaching out to sort of anyone who is sort of identifying themselves as being part of the kind of PCD world nationally. So I think that all has a part to play. So supporting parents to support young people, supporting the teams to support young people, but also working directly with young people themselves and helping them support each other too.
That sounds fabulous. I've got one more question from Lucy, and then I think we're going to have to wrap up.
I was just going to add a little bit on the end of that, Heloise. I mean, your talk has been really, really, really helpful. And just to sort of reiterate and reassure everyone that mental health and psychology and how this weaves in with PCD is absolutely sort of top of the agenda at PCD Support UK as well. And that's right the way through from, you know, newly diagnosed families, children, right the way through to adults, you know, young and old. And I think in the coming years, hopefully we will see that become sort of more and more embedded into the way that we talk and think about PCD, because obviously you've got to be equipped with the tools to be able to look after yourself long term, haven't you? And I think that's something that a lot of people up to this point have had to learn by themselves or develop kind of techniques to do that. I have one very quick question, Heloise, if you don't mind, which is just about routine setting and habit forming. And obviously PCD takes a lot of treatment sometimes, and that's something that can be quite hard to sort of keep into a habit of. For people that have fallen out of a habit of doing their physio and things like that, do you have any top tips that are kind of useful for getting back into the swing of things?
Good question. I think first of all, congratulating yourself that you've noticed that you've fallen out of routine is the place to start, because I think often at that point we're beating ourselves up unfairly, really, because it's just part of life. Falling off, getting back on, falling off, getting back on is often how it goes. In terms of sort of top tips, if you can, linking any new behavior with a behavior that's already established tends to help. So, you know, if you need to do something around bedtime, rather than it just sort of being around bedtime, doing it before brushing your teeth, for example, so that every time you look at your toothbrush, there is a trigger there. Thinking about where you're locating whatever it is, so if it's like a box of medication or whatever, you know, where that goes. So in that scenario, it might go next to your toothbrush so that there is another trigger. So the main barrier essentially at that point to establishing a new routine is memory. So thinking about how you can get around that and using what you're already doing in order to do it is helpful. The other barrier can often be motivation. And that's a particularly tricky one, I think, especially when, you know, oh, I could do that, or I could just carry on watching EastEnders or something. You know, for most of us, we know what will win. If you're already sat down watching something, you can't really quite be bothered to get up and go and do whatever it is that's not fun, that you know you have to do, should do, etc., etc. So thinking through that and thinking about how can I help myself actually achieve it, you know, thinking through a specific time. It might be that you say, okay, I will do that at 8 o'clock every night, or every 2 nights, or whenever you need to do it, and then helping yourself to remain motivated by, you know, setting an alarm, that kind of thing, which is just that kind of tangible trigger that is harder to push away. Yes, you can snooze it, then it will come back, but really, you know, that moment of shutting down an alarm is usually, as adults anyway, something that we will generally be less bad at doing. That's not the right way to put it, but young people, I think, often are a little bit different with that. So I would encourage for young people the same memory prompts approach, but in terms of motivation, it might well be that parents have to play a little bit more of a role, and that parents have to help young people think through their own barriers. So if they go, oh, I'll do it at 6:30 every day, the parent might go, do you remember at 6:30 you're normally on the phone to Alicia? And then they'll be like, oh yeah, I can't really imagine you doing it when you're engaged in a conversation with Alicia. It's like, good point. So when do you think it's realistic to do it? You know, just helping them think through it can be quite helpful. And really it's a parallel process as adults, because we're sort of having that internal discussion, aren't we? So yeah, seeing the two issues really as motivation and memory, and trying to think through all the different scenarios, all the different barriers that might happen and the different ways in which we can try and overcome them, and then reflect on it. Give yourself a few days or a week to try it out, and then sit down and think, okay, did I manage to achieve it every day this week? You know, were there any days that were harder? Was there anything that made it more complicated? Is there anything I should change for next week? Life is not perfection. Perfection is not a word that I think really applies to life ever. I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but and acknowledging it and just being kind to yourself, and giving yourself the chance to review and make a new plan.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we're going to have to leave it at that as we are over time, but thank you so much for giving up your evening to talk to us, Heloise. It's absolutely fantastic. And anybody have any more questions, please, you can email us at the comms email address, so comms@pcdsupport.org.uk, and I will forward those messages on to Heloise and let you know the answers. Other news, we have our AGM next month. So we're also going to have a Q&A with lots of PCD experts. So that's on the 19th of June. So get in touch if you want the details, or you can head to our social media. There's loads of information there. But we also have a bake-off competition. So any avid bakers, I would love to see some PCD themed bakes. And so you can email your entries to my address, or if you'd like any more information, just get in touch and I'd love to hear more from you. But for now, thank you so much, Heloise, and I hope you have a wonderful evening, and thank you everybody for joining us, and we will see you very soon.
Thank you all for having me. Have a nice evening.
Thanks, Heloise. That was amazing. Really, really great.